Thank you for that warm introduction. And also, it's a great pleasure to be here in the most beautiful and historically important city of Istanbul at this very important meeting. I will be speaking from a European perspective and echoing many of the things we have just heard in the excellent presentation that has come before me, looking at the Turkish situation. I need to find the right button first. No. Okay. I have done this before, once or twice, in case you were wondering. So what I wanted to do in my presentation is talk a little bit about the early warning system on NPS within the context of the work of my agency, the European Monitoring Agency. And then I wanted to update you on some of the most recent developments we're seeing in this area. So, many of you will know who we are. We have a slightly strange name, but for those who don't, we are the designated hub for all drugs information within the European Union. We were established in 1993 and been active in Lisbon, Portugal, the beautiful city of Lisbon, since 1995. And we work with all EU member states and Turkey and Norway. And in terms of what we do, I think our regulation gives you a good overview of that. We're responsible for factual, objective, reliable and comparable information at the European level concerning all aspects of drugs and addiction. So we're very interested in demand and supply side data, but also we monitor responses, what's considered best practice, and laws and policy developments. But what I want to talk to you today about is a slightly different aspect of our work, and that's quite a strange thing in the European Union framework in drugs. It's the Council decision, so it has a legal base at European level. So very few things in the drugs area have a European legal base on the risk assessment of new psychoactive substances. So I think it's first just a good thing to start with what do we mean, and within the current legal instrument we have a very clear definition of what we mean by an NPS, and it's linked very closely to the international conventions of 61 and 71. So for us, a new narcotic or psychotropic drug is covered by the mechanism if it is not controlled by the conventions, but crucially has a similar risk to health or social health risk of those drugs controlled under the conventions. So very much it's a system that is intended to provide a fast-track mechanism for Europe for controlling things that are similar threat to health as things already controlled under the existing international framework. In terms of who's involved in the mechanism, we coordinated very closely with our partners at Europol. Law enforcement and toxicological information is very important here, but we also now work with the European Commission, our focal points in all member states, and also increasingly the European Medicines Agency. And there's increasing, I think, overlap between what we do in this area and some of the issues that affect the pharmacovigilance system in Europe. Okay, the mechanism, I think, is a free trial system. And the bit that's most interesting to me is that first level, and the first level is the real-time information exchange system. It's the early warning system. And what we do, we have in real time, we exchange information between countries on what's happening in this area. And I think that's the most interesting part of the system to me. But that can trigger, on occasion, a more formal exercise, and that's a risk assessment exercise conducted by our scientific committee. And there they look at a drug and compare it to evaluate its health risk potential at a European level. And then that report can trigger a political process at the council level, and the council can decide, as they did last week, to place substances under control at the European level, and then all EU member states have 12 months to introduce controls using their domestic drug laws. In terms of the information coming into the system, it's an event-based system compared to what we normally do, which is more aggregate data or collected data. So what we get is constantly individual events being reported to the system, and we have to evaluate them over time. Forensic analysis and toxicology information is at the heart of the system, but we also get information from law enforcement, open sources, the research and grey literature, and also more proactive measures such as test purchasing, wastewater analysis, and computational modelling. Once the information, just to show you what happens when it gets to Lisbon, it's entered into the new drugs database, and this gives an update of the reports coming in, or literally on a daily basis. You can search by drug. It gives you scientific chemical information about the drug. It gives you identification information, and it lets you see which countries have reported it and identified that substance so far. And it's intended as a catalyst for information and sharing and action between European countries and countries participating in the mechanism. So that's to give you an overview of what we do in terms of structures. Let me now talk a little bit about content. And let me look at NPS and give a historical overview of what we've seen in the time we've been monitoring these substances in Lisbon. And very much, I think here, we've seen a move from what you would call imitation to replacement. So if we go back to the 1990s, we saw the phenethylamines coming in, subsequently the tryptamines, and these were what we call designer drugs. And by that I mean that's a description of the market. They were intended as replacement substances for illicit drugs. They were made in illicit labs, and they were sold often to users who unknowingly consumed them as ecstasy or amphetamine. So they were replacement substances. They were imitation substances. And then around 2000, we have the piperazines coming in, and subsequently the catenones and the synthetic cannabinoids. And here we have a change in the market. We see substances suddenly being marketed as products in their own rights. And we see it first with BZP and the party pills, and subsequently with some of the methadone products and the spice products. So we've seen a change there from imitation to drugs that seek to offer legal alternatives to controlled substances. Let me give you just an overview of what the timeline works when the mechanism works completely, and this is for the drug methadone that some of you will be familiar with. And methadone was first detected in the EU in Finland in 2007. It was notified to the mechanism early in 2008, and it was subsequently placed under European control in 2010. So quite a rapid diffusion of what was an unknown substance. And if you look at that diffusion, what you see is that within 3 years, all countries reporting had identified this substance on their territories. I have to say this diffusion pattern is not common for all MPS. We see some drugs coming in and only affecting a smaller number of countries and then disappearing from the market, but potentially then to appear again later elsewhere. Let me talk a little bit about the synthetic cannabinoids because I think they're an interesting case example. Way back in 2008, it was German researchers who identified JW018 almost by accident in a sample of herbal smoking mixture, spice mixture. And then very quickly after that, this group of chemicals became to be one of the dominant ones reported to the early warning system. I think many people get confused here. It was already illustrated today in the presentation before mine, that this is a complex group of people. Think of these things as being similar. They happen all to act on the same receptor, but in fact they're very different set of chemical groups. And we can't assume that the health consequences are similar between these chemicals, even to themselves or to cannabis. They are a diverse group of complex substances, and we know nothing about their long-term implications for health. I was proud and that we in the early warning system were picked up on this new phenomenon of the synthetic cannabinoids very early. 2008, the substance wasn't known very rapidly. We had our first meeting on this subject in 2009, our first report. And I think that really demonstrates the value of the early warning system. But before I'm too proud, I have to reflect on that the world has changed dramatically. And let me take you back to a night late in 2006 when a user called, someone called Mexican Seafood comes in late at night and posts on the blue light site a message that they've been smoking this herbal mixture called Spice, and it was very strong stuff. Did anybody know what it was? Within 24 hours, we have first mad scientists coming online, pointing out that this was not a herbal mixture, but it was likely to be a synthetic cannabinoid. Within the middle of the next day, we have Sumatra pointing out that they've done analysis of this substance, and it was likely to be one of the HU group of compounds, and that they would be surprised if this was going to be legal in a year or two from then. This was 2 years before we had first identified a synthetic cannabinoid in the spice product, so it's 2 years before the scientific or practice community woke up to this problem. And I think it demonstrates the importance of the internet and knowledge transfer and chemically educated users in this phenomenon. So let me now give you a little bit of pictures of the substances we're monitoring in Europe. We've got now over 500 substances in the mechanism, and if we go back to 2005, before that, probably about in the preceding 5 or 6 years, only about 30 substances. And then we saw in 2006, we saw the piperazines coming in, the party pills. Then we saw these, the caffeinones coming in 2008, and then the synthetic cannabinoids coming in 2009. But when I look at what's been reported now, I think a lot of our concerns are in this brown group at the top. These are new substances that don't fit into any of our traditional monitoring groups. We've got synthetic opioids, we've got complicated, strange compounds, we've got very novel compounds. And this, I think, is giving many of the concerns about what we're seeing now in terms of the public health implications of some of these drugs. In terms of risk assessment, we've tended to set the bar quite high, and before 2013, we'd only gone to a formal risk assessment exercise on 13 compounds. But to give you some idea about how things are speeding up, so far we've had 5 risk assessments in 2014, we have another one planned, and we have a number of other substances that are beginning to cause us concern. And if you look at some of these substances we've risk assessed this year, I think it gives you an overview of the diversity and concern about what's happening in this part of the market. We've had a very potent hallucinogenic product. We've had a very potent synthetic opiate. We've had a very strong stimulant, a more powerful stimulant than cocaine, and we've had a ketamine-like drug based on a medicinal product. So we see products here targeting all the main segments of the illicit drug market, and there was particular aspects of the chemistry of each of those products that made you very concerned about their public health implications, and even more concerned, I suspect, than the illicit drugs in some respects that they were seeking to imitate or replace. So let me say a little bit about AH7921. It's a synthetic opioid. It was invented in the 70s. It's a potent U-opioid receptor agonist. We've seen some non-fatal intoxications and some deaths. It's potent, it's more potent than morphine, but it responds to naloxone. And if you look at its timeline, this is essentially a failed medicine. It was invented in 1973 by Allen and Hanbury. It was tested, there was a few receptor studies in the 1980s, and then it disappeared from view, only to appear in internet chatter around 2010, and then to be risk assessed in 2014, and last week placed under control in the European Union. And I'm not a chemist, and I get terribly confused by some of the chemical names in this area. I have chemists at work who try and explain it to me. I'm simple, but the new chemistry is causing all sorts of confusions here. And I apologize for the mistake on this slide. This is a Google search term, and this is AH791 is often sold as, is also called doxalam. Sometimes it's referred to as doxamine, but doxamine is actually an antihistamine drug that's sometimes used to treat sleep disorder. This can be confusing, and it can be sometimes have tragic consequences. This is a case report on a gentleman that thought he was buying doxamine to treat his insomnia, but in fact had bought a powerful synthetic opiate and unfortunately overdosed. Let me move now briefly on to the N-bomb products. These appeared in Europe, but also in Australia and the US about the same time. They're very powerful hallucinogenic substances. They were being sold, we think, certainly in the same form as LSD, a drug we haven't seen much of in Europe for a long time. But the drug is more toxic than LSD in certain ways, and we are seeing a number of fatalities. One of the problems here is this drug is active in such small quantities, it's extremely difficult to detect in biological samples. So therefore it could have had more effect, but you've got to get really lucky to actually identify the fact that the substance has been consumed, simply because it's consumed in such microgram, the active dose is so low. And that brings me on to a slightly more general point of what we're seeing both in the illicit drugs market and in the NPS area, where we're seeing the introduction of synthetic substances that are active at very, very highly potent. And this, I think, creates both a public health and a drug addiction law enforcement challenge. We now see substances that can be multiple doses can be transported in small volumes across borders or sent in small packages. And we also see substances where the difference between a desired dose and an overdose can be measured in the microgram level. So both in terms of public health and law enforcement, these new synthetic substances, I think, will become an increasing challenge in the future. So finally, to sum up, what we see today is in terms of the NPS area in Europe, we see a very crowded phenomenon, a very complicated phenomenon with substances appearing in different sections of the market. We still see the legal highs either sold online or in shops, sold in bright coloured packaging intended to replace as legal replacements to illicit substances. We increasingly see designer drugs where these are non-controlled substances appearing still being manufactured in illicit labs, and we've seen now production of NPS in Europe being sold in the illicit drug market. We see controlled NPS, when member states have banned substances like methadone, some of these now have moved into the illicit drug market and become products in their own right. We see this market research chemicals of interest as psychonauts, which are purchased by often quite chemically literate individuals online in small white packages, often with fatal results. Some of them turn out to be very toxic. We have the whole area of medicinal products, both diverted within the EU and imported from outside the EU, or tweaked medicines, so medicines where small changes are made to their chemical structure. And the overlap there with the area in counterfeit medicines. And we see this confusing new area of products coming in as dietary supplements, training aids for sports, study aids, lifestyle products, herbal medicines, some of which may contain synthetic substances, not always labelled. And you see substances moving between these different, over time, and even at the same time within these different market sectors. All in all, therefore, I think this area still remains a dynamic one, and one that represents a real challenge for our current models of drug control and public health. Thank you.